Okay, good afternoon, Dr. Tony Letai, Professor of Medicine from Harvard Medical School. We are delighted to have you here at the PhD Summit.
Delighted to be here, Dr. Ní Chonghaile.
So Professor Tony Letai did his undergraduate degree in physics in Princeton, and then he went on and do an MD PhD because one doctor wasn't good enough for him at the University of Chicago. He did his PhD with Professor Elaine Fuchs, a Howard Hughes investigator, and then he went on to do postdoctoral training with Stanley Korsmeyer, another Howard Hughes investigator. So Tony, he's won numerous awards. He's a Kimmel Scholar Award. He's a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society Scholarship Award. And he's also recently become president of the Society for Functional Precision Medicine. So Tony, we're delighted to have you here today to chat to us about your career to date.
Great to be here, Tríona.
Yeah, full disclosure though, I guess I should admit that I worked for you for 5 years.
Five long years.
I guess I'm here to ensure that there's, you know, a certain level of honesty. So I was wondering, Tony, could you chat us through your career to date? So maybe if we start with your PhD with Elaine Fuchs.
Sure. I have to say that a lot of the choices I've made are probably very different. I think I'm maybe in some of the life choices a bit less analytical than some people. So like it's kind of a big choice to, you know, what lab you want to work in. So I have to say, the reason why I chose to work in Elaine's lab was really, she'd been lecturing in a class, and I thought her, with Sue Lin, the late Sue Lindquist, it was a great class in molecular biology the two of them gave. And I loved her explanations, they're very clear, so I rotated in her lab, and I sort of liked what I was doing, and everyone seemed like a decent lab and seemed like I'd be reasonably happy there. And that was really the level of my analysis of what to do, because I didn't come in, coming from a physics background, I was quite unsophisticated biologically. Perhaps I still am. And I didn't have, like some people, I was very daunted by people around me who like knew all sorts of stuff I didn't know about, like, oh, this technique or this, what, I didn't know anything about anything. I just sort of was like, well, people seem basically happy there, and people seem to be leaving her lab and being relatively successful. Now, back then, Elaine Fuchs wasn't the Elaine Fuchs we know now. She was, I think she received tenure like while I was there, and then got the Hughes while I was there. I tell her it was because I was there. I'm not sure that holds a lot of water. But like really became famous while I was in her lab. All doing the work that I had next to no part in, but that was how that I didn't choose it because I really just chose it because it felt sort of comfortable, and I did work there that I was interested in. It gave me an opportunity. I was sort of interested in like a little more on the biophysical side of things, and I was able to. It was very interesting to me how keratin filaments, back then she did a lot of work on keratin filaments, and how they formed dimers and then oligomerized. And I found that actually sort of interesting. Not that I wasn't interested in the work, but that really wasn't the primary motivation for what I did.
Yeah, amazing. And now it's kind of come full circle in that she's now a cancer biologist nearly, right? Her field.
I gotta say, yeah, it's true. Well, Lainey's like mistress or master of like whatever she wants to be. So, and like but she also, I think she would tell you that she doesn't always have like 10-year master plans. Yeah. And maybe I learned this from her now that I'm saying it more than I think, but like, I think she tends to like, you just go where the science leads you. And I think part of that is that you can't always see 10 steps ahead, 10 years ahead, which is the absurdity of these 5-year R01 grants when people are like poring over every word and every letter and trying to decide, looks like in year 4, there's something there. Like, year 4, give me a break. No, that's like, just like do a retrospective reading of R01s and like what people actually end up doing and what they propose, and there's very little relation.
Yeah, it's totally true. I think fund the person, right, should be right the way. But anyway.
Yeah, of course it's a difficult decision, because then like there's clearly some people that are more successful than others. And what do? Just heap all the resources on those people? I mean, there has to be some aspect of division and planning and so forth. But I don't pretend to have an answer. I think it's a very complicated problem.
Yeah. And was she a kind of a hands-on supervisor, mentor, or was it more like fluid?
Well, it's interesting. Partly one of my worst nightmares came true in her lab. So she always thought I was super lazy because I took up golf, and there was a public course nearby. And so I would regularly on, plenty of afternoons walk out to the course with some friends of mine, including Mark Anderson, who's now a famous professor at UCSF, and national academician. But he was my roommate, and we would go out and play golf for a while. But I would come back then I wasn't married, didn't have kids. So I would come back and work in the evenings and stuff, like unobserved. And I got plenty of work done, was plenty productive as a grad student. I wasn't a goof off, but I had very irregular hours. And then halfway through my PhD, Lainey had this horrendous idea of doing a sabbatical in her own lab because she wanted to get back to the laboratory. So you couldn't get more hands-on than that. And curse her, she chose to work in the bay that I was working in, like in the bench. It was just adjacent to where I was. So I had to make a tough decision, but I said I got to be who I am, and I still pretty much kept up the same work habits. But I think she eventually came to terms with it because, like, although I did have these habits that weren't what she was used to, I ended up with like 3 good papers out of her lab, which is pretty good for a graduate student career. She also was very suspicious because I was going for an MD and not a pure PhD. But I think she sort of eventually wrapped. I say all these things like there was like an antagonist relationship between us, but not at all. We're very good friends, and she was a very good mentor. And I think she eventually came to terms with me and had MD, PhD students after me. So that wasn't the last.
Fantastic. So then you moved on and you finished your MD, you did your training, and you did a postdoctoral with Stan Korsmeyer, who I used to have a photo of in my lab bench. What was it like working for Stan?
So he was great. He was a great, really legendary great mentor. And you can look at how he has populated the faculties of medical schools and biology departments around the world. With his graduates, he's a very good model for me, and it's too bad you never got to know him. He both just like a very decent, normal person, grew up as his family was pig farmers from Southern Illinois, and he was a big success story. Lainey was also from Illinois. It's funny how both of them came from there. He just sort of worked his way up through merit, was a very smart person, but very kind, very, decent. He had a big lab. So I wouldn't say his management style wasn't to be like pouring over me all the time. He was available when I needed help. He's just like, and he was smart, was smart and had good ideas and a really good like gut instinct for, what to do next. So for me, he's a very good mentor. I think, like I've probably told you before, if I'm usually at an impasse, I'd literally just try to say, what would Stan do in this sort of situation? And it works out pretty well.
I also hear him every time I write something, as in put a full stop in it, Tríona.
That's right. That was the best editing advice he ever gave me, is like, I had this tendency early on to write these grandiloquent sentences of many clauses, and he was working through one of those with me once, and Jesus Christ, Letai, put a period in there somewhere.
Fantastic. So then you went on, you set up your own group at the Dana-Farber, and in terms of your own lab, how do you decide, who to hire? Do you think about the attributes of the individual, or do you think about the team structure, or do you think at any way at all that higher level, or is it just individual people who come to you and approach you?
Yeah, it's so funny. I think it's hard to have any hard and fast rules, because ultimately hiring people is very important. But it's not like a high jump or something like that where there's a really well-defined metric that you can use. You want to hire someone who has had some history of success. Okay, if they've had no history of success, the odds are they're not going to succeed in your lab. You know, someone who has, in our field, that means some publications. You definitely contact their prior supervisors. And honestly, if there's any hint of any sort of a problem, that's not a person you can go for, because it's actually pretty easy to just get along working in a lab. You don't have to, and people who can't do that, you just don't want any part of that. But I have to say, that hasn't been a big deal in the interviewing I've done. Once you do that, you bring them in, see if they can give the good talk, see if they can talk on their feet and answer questions, if they're capable of coming up with ideas, and have them meet their other people in the lab and make sure that it looks like they're likely to get along and likely to have a productive experience. And you don't always, I mean, I always feel like I'm going to work with these people. I want to come to work and enjoy I'm working with. So it's also has to be people that you just plain enjoy work, being around. And again, like so much of what I do, it's very haphazard. I don't have any hard and fast rules, but absolutely you need to talk to everyone. In the days of Zoom, I've now hired some people who are in my lab now who I didn't meet in person. There was no possibility of meeting them in person. I had like 4 positions to fill during this kind of quarantine period, and I filled them over Zoom, and those have all worked out fine. But I think it obviously would be better if I could have met them in person.
Yeah, that's great. And then in terms of your work week, how do you divide your time? Is there certain things that you prioritize, focus your attention on, and sort of what do you try to avoid distractions throughout your week?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I have to divide this into like COVID world and non-COVID world. COVID world has been very good to me in that I work most of the time at home as instructed by my institute, and which really doesn't affect my work too much because most of my work is done on a computer. I have not been like a hands-on in the lab doing experiments mentor for many years, as you know. I even before you arrived in the lab, 10 plus years ago. I'd forsaken that simply because I was too much of a dilettante and everyone was finishing up my experiments for me all the time and I had too much travel and whatnot. But now I have no travel and it's wonderful. I mean, there are aspects of travel that I like, but I think I was doing too much of it. Now I can organize my own time and it's really, there's so much less stress on my schedule. I don't need to focus on this. I think on my schedule as much and how to craft time for myself because it's just there naturally. I have fewer meetings, fewer things, and I'm not spending time traveling. So that's very good. I do think it's important to put in your schedule. When I have more pressure on my schedule, do think it's important to have chunks of time so you're not constantly squeezing in this and that in a half hour between meetings. I think during a half hour between meetings, that's where you can get things done, like answering your emails and checking off boxes of all sorts of minutia that really occupy your day. But if you want to write a paper, have a new idea, craft a grant, write a specific game, you want to make sure you have minimum like 2-hour chunks that you can just sit and think. Because I know for me, it takes a while just to kind of like get into it and like work. I feel like I'm literally like digging my way into it. And then can I think? And then I'll have like a burst of, I think, really good productivity that can last 30 to 60 minutes. And then I'll get a little tired and need to get a cup of tea or something like that, and then maybe do the process again. But I maybe there are people, but I can't sustain like true creativity or like hard work for like hour after hour for like a 6-hour stretch.
And do you turn off your emails in those chunks, or like so to avoid those pings and distractions coming through, or no?
So I don't have alerts on anything. That's for sure. I think I should be more disciplined about not checking my email. All too often, I won't have it like open in front of me, but all too often I'll like be working on something, take a break and hit it open. I think it's a bad habit. And sometimes I do try to do what you do. I have it next to me right now. I will try to like literally put my phone in a different room from me because again, it's like all too easy to pick it up, check the news, check your email or whatever, look at some funny pictures. But yeah, so I think all those things are really designed these things we're surrounded with are literally designed by super smart minds and algorithms to distract us. Mm-hmm. So I think we can just close our email and do all these things. The thing is, email is kind of a two-edged sword. It's actually, to me, a very efficient work tool. And a lot of my drafts and exchanges with people I work with, collaborators and trainees, are done via email. So it actually is a reference tool for me as well. And I use it that way. So it is a little hard for me to shut it off completely. It would be nice if there's a way to segregate those two functions, but I haven't figured out a way.
Brilliant, yeah. And so one definitely, I suppose, ideal I heard from your lab while I was there is motion is not progress.
Oh yeah, I would love to take credit for that, but I heard it first from Scott Oakes, who was a postdoc with me in Stan Korsmeyer's lab, and now actually, I'm not exactly, he might be in University of Chicago now. He was at UCSF for a while, but then he just became, I think, like a department head somewhere. He was a great guy. Is a great guy, I hope. I just haven't seen him for a while. Yeah, and the idea is that, like, this was something I found very daunting in every laboratory situation I've worked in, okay, is I've been surrounded by people who are far more industrious than I am, and they're constantly bustling around, working far longer hours than I am, and producing more blots and more stuff than I am, without a doubt, okay, and doing all these sorts of things. But I have to say, and you're asking about a strategy, so it's hard to say this without being braggy, but like, I have to say, at the end of the day, when I sort of came to the realization after I stood back and like compared myself to those people, is that, like, in terms of actually producing what we need to produce, which is like new ideas, new papers and so forth, I was doing at least as well as them. And that was because I think I spent more time on honing the question, so that one approach is like, you do all of this, just so you can carve out one, certain. The other thing is you just do this so there's less carving at the end. And I think I worked harder to do that. Part of that was, I think you see this, is like I had a bunch of demands on me as a postdoctoral fellow. Certainly, I was growing a family, and I literally had to provide for them. So I was doing a lot of like clinical lighting, like overnights a couple times a week, and I was like physically very tired a lot of the time. And I had to be efficient in the way I designed my experiments, because I couldn't be there long hours. A, I wanted to see my family. B, I was just sapped. I wasn't able to do that, but it worked out fine. It's always, I think science is very funny in that I think most people go into science because they think they're smart and they want to prove they're smart, and they're fascinated by being with smart people and that type of thing. And then the second we get into science as doing it as a business, at least in the biological sciences, a lot of people, and I fell into this trap for a while too, suddenly it's all about what your hands can do, not what your brain can do. And I think if you want to be happy as a scientist, you want to make sure that you're doing something, you're using your brain. That's the thing that sets you apart from the other people who aren't scientists, or the people who you're going to compete for resources and so forth. Hopefully it's your brain. I think that's how you can have a successful and happy career, is for your brain to do the work, not for just like your hands, not to do 10 immunoblots when one right immunoblot would do, if you just think about it ahead of time. But I think some people, I don't know, it's hard to project, but some people are insecure if they're not working really hard. And I've detected this too, and I detected it myself too, and I got better as I got older, is this feeling that if you are doing the career of science and you are not working to the point of exhaustion, you're not working hard enough. And I reject that totally. I think that working to the point of exhaustion, you do a lot of useless work. I mean, when I did that, the stuff, often complicated experiments, didn't work because I was too tired to execute them properly. And it also makes for a miserable life. You have to design work-life habits that you can sustain for hopefully 40 years of a scientific career. And if you're miserable all the time, you can't do it. I'm always struck by, on Twitter, on science Twitter, I follow a bunch of people on Twitter, social media, hear people talking, the amount of like whinging there is going on. And what I feel is that, like, look, you're smart people with excellent credentials. If you are truly this unhappy, do something else, because biological sciences are like a great place to be. There's a lot of places you can use a PhD in, like education, communication, industry, I'm probably missing out a bunch of stuff. Stock working for like, venture funds and that type of thing. If you're miserable working in an academic environment, my God, there's so many other things that you could possibly be doing. Don't do that. And I don't understand people who are miserable and they year after year, oh my God, Ian Grant's so miserable, work 7 days. Like, do something else, for crying out loud.
But I totally agree with you. But your environment is different. So I think that's something that you set up in your lab, was sort of a do your work, do it whenever you want. I remember the first day I interviewed with you, you said, Tríona, I don't care what time when you come into the lab. I won't be looking if you're here at 7 a.m, or if you're here. It's just, I base it on, you get stuff done, you get stuff done. And I think other people who feel the need to work all the time are sort of comparing themselves to others around them and feeling, also depending on potentially the environment could be slightly different, where there's the pressure from a PI to be there at times and to be, who think that motion is progress.
Right. And part of it is there's only so much of a hypocrite I wanted to be. So one of the things, so a long time ago, when I was reaching, I did when you do the MD PhD, you do a ton of training. Okay. So I was like in my mid to late 30s before I was like leaving training. Okay. That's how long it is, because of the postdocs and the specialty training, all this sort of thing. And I had a chance, but I was so broadly trained, I could do so many different things. I could practice as an oncologist, I could work for industry, or I could pursue academic medicine. And one of the things that was really daunting to me about academic medicine was just this idea of, like, if I wasn't working to the point of exhaustion, that I just wasn't working hard enough. And I saw, and Dana-Farber can be a very busy place with a lot of people who are working that way, very, very workaholic. And I talked to a colleague of mine, and hope he doesn't mind my saying his name, Jim DiCaprio. He works right next door to me now. Just went for a bike ride with him, in fact. And he's a little senior to me, and he kind of got me into oncology. And I remember saying, Jim, I don't know if I want to do academic medicine. I just do not want to work weekends. And he goes, I don't work weekends. He runs his own lab. And then I said, really? Why not? He goes, because I don't want to. And that bell rung in my head. I suddenly realized that is a totally underestimated advantage of running your own lab, is that, honestly, if I have grants to pay for my people, and if I produce my papers, okay, I can murder people as long as the bodies aren't found, and my administration doesn't care. Okay, it's just like nothing else about it. You can do whatever you want, and you have total control over your schedule. You're a mature big boy now. You can set it however you want. And Jim, just like, suddenly I realized, oh my God, it's like total autonomy. As a matter of fact, treated properly, this is exactly what I want. And I think the problem is a lot of people don't treat it properly. The fact is, with computers, I could work all weekend. I could work all night too. And the kids are out of the house too, right? So I don't have that excuse, like I have to spend time with the children. But I don't. I work, you asked about my work week. I work as you probably know, I work Monday to Friday. Okay. Mm-hmm. I do not work weekends. And I work, when I am at work, I focus, I'm efficient with my time. But I don't work Saturday and Sunday. I imagine as emergencies rarely come up, I'll try to address them on the weekend, freezer down or whatever, that sort of thing. But I don't answer work emails in general over the weekend. There's plenty of time. I do that. I'll tell you what I do. Friday, I think it's good to have things that separate you from work. Now, that was easier when I commuted. Okay. What I would do is, like, I'd come home and that would be it. I wouldn't be doing lab work when I'm at home. Now with COVID, like many people, I am working at home. It becomes a little more difficult to separate myself, but I basically close my computer, before dinner, and I tell my wife, done working for the day, and I stick to that. And I'm done working for the day, and I do other stuff that's the other part of me. And you have to have this other stuff that's the other part of you. It can't be all work. You have to have other interests. Maybe they're your children, your family, travel, music, cooking, any of these things. You have to have these other things to embrace. What's that? Roses, exactly, growing roses. So my favorite COVID tradition that we have now, so with my wife, is that, like, every Friday I get done work, I walk downstairs to my sunroom, which you probably know, and there's a little bell there. And I ring that bell, And that's the message. That's the signal to my wife that I am done for the week. And we both go and have a martini and play cribbage. And that separates my work week from the weekend. And I keep that inviolate. And I think it's so hard to not work all the time that it helps to have some sort of ritual or routine or something that allows you to strictly separate work from normal life, and it keeps you sane. If you have work just like constantly spinning around like a hamster on a wheel all the time in your mind, you don't have time to take perspective, and it can drive you crazy.
Do you think it helps creativity as well, baby?
Definitely.
Having that time off, you need it to.
Oh, definitely. I think that sort of idleness is underappreciated as a stimulus for creativity. I think that it's something not just in science, but society in general, having one of these. Like, so if I used to have to wait in a line at the supermarket or the store or the bank or whatever it is, my mind would be free to wander and pick up new things, make new connections that it hadn't made before. Now I'm checking a football score or something like that. I actually try not to do it. I try to leave my phone on, but it's all too easy to do these sorts of things. And if you're going for a run, well, you can listen to all the music that you want. But actually, I try not to do that often. Often what I try to do is I'll intentionally go for exercises and runs, stuff like that, where I don't have any other distraction. And then my mind doesn't have these crutches to like keep itself stimulated. It has to stimulate itself with ideas and connections. And I think that you have to be, you can't be busy if you're going to make these new connections. You have to have this like idleness, which is very self-serving to Assay, but I think this idleness is actually very healthy, and it's part of how we're made.
Definitely, yeah. So do you think all your great ideas have come from runs? Can you scientifically quantify
No, this? I'm not a good enough runner. If I depended on my time running for that, I think I'd be a far worse scientist, because I'm just not fit enough to do enough running. No, I actually couldn't say. I will say this too, is that like, you don't need that many big ideas over a career, because biological science is so slow that to really fully work out an idea, like I thought there was a great idea that you developed in my laboratory that you and I are still working on, this idea that mitochondrial priming relates to a lot of important phenotypes in terms of response to therapies in cancer cells. Okay, I think I'll finish my career and that will still be an incompletely tested idea. You need to have good ideas more than you need to have millions of ideas, I think. And I think that's a problem. I think that's also a trap people can fall into, the idea that you need millions of ideas. And I'm more of like, what is it? People talk about the fox and the hedgehog. And I guess I am more of a hedgehog guy. The idea that a hedgehog doesn't know many things, but he knows a few things well. And I think you can only do a few things well as a scientist. You can't do many things. But I will make an amendment. I was thinking about this. I'm a hedgehog who's a little bit like a prairie dog. Do you have prairie dogs? I don't think you guys do. I think it's an American animal. So if you think of prairie dogs, they're these things that live out in the prairie, as you might imagine, and they live in little holes, and they pop up and they feed, and they're very vulnerable creatures. So when they pop up and they're feeding or something like that, their heads are constantly whipping around, scanning the horizon. They live in flat terrain generally, so they can see a long way. Then if there's trouble, they get back down in their holes, okay? But I think you have to have a bit of a prairie dog in you as well, which is, or another way I say it is have your mind, your head on a swivel. For me, reading and being exposed to ideas is not about understanding all the details, but understanding the possibilities, understanding the potential that is out there. And if there's something cool coming along, having a mind that's receptive to making a connection, like, oh wow, that could be a cool thing. You know, maybe I should explore this. The price you pay for that is this constant fear of missing out on a great idea. Okay, that if you're always thinking like, could that be a great idea? Could that be a great idea? You have to make decisions. You have to prioritize what you're going to pursue and what you aren't. And most of the stuff, 99% of what you think of, you got to throw away. You're only going to choose very few ideas. So you got to keep your mind prepared to identify these great new ideas, but you throw away most of that and only pursue a couple. And it can be that to me is one of the most stressful parts of the job, is worrying about like, did I choose the right next cool thing, or could I have chose something else that's even cooler?
It's a hard life, isn't it?
Yeah.
So definitely, when you're giving presentations, Tony, I think we talked about this a lot when I was in your lab, and it's probably come across here. You're really informative but highly entertaining. Do you have thoughts on this? How do you structure your talks? How do you give mentorship and guidance to your PhDs and postdocs, and how to do that? And
well, I think you have to remember that you are talking to humans all the time. For starters, I find it more fun to be. It's just, you want to enjoy, again, talks are something you're going to do a lot. Try to do it in a way that's going to be fun for you. And I find it more fun if I can engage the audience and develop some sort of rapport with my audience. You are communicating to humans, and some people, and you can see this in the way to write their R01s too, which can be very painful, think that if I can just say words out loud for 30 minutes straight, I'll be conveying a ton of information. If I could say twice as many words as the next person, I am communicating twice as much information. That is totally wrong. Think about the talks you have gone to and what you can remember, what you can retain, what you can take from it. At most, if you're lucky, you can remember a couple points, maybe 3 points from a talk someone gave. So I tend to work from there and go backwards and say, like, what are the three big, and this is how I try to write my papers too. And so it's like, what are the three big points I want to convey? And then I make sure that those get conveyed, sometimes with repetition, maybe with a joke or a picture or a few metaphors. I think metaphors and pictures are really, really important. And I try to make good use of those. But to just, avoid lists. People who say, like, okay, I have a summary points, and then, oh my God, there's like 10 bullet points, and then they read them all to you. Oh my God, that is the absolute worst didactic strategy possible, because not only are you not conveying information, people hate you when you do that. So don't do that. Don't go long, trim it down. And if you could convey 3 things, you are a communication superhero. People just aren't able to retain any more than a relatively small amount of information. It's just the way we are as human beings. I'll tell you though, it also depends on the audience. I think I've told you this before, but you may have an Irish audience, so I'll tell you. So I was on this trip, and I'd spoken in Ireland, and I gave a talk, and it went over very well. And then, if I may say so myself, and then I gave basically the same talk to a German audience in Frankfurt. Okay, and it happened to be my daughter Kate, who at that time was in college, and she's now a budding scientist herself. So she's like with the program, understands it. I said, hey, come along, watch me talk. I'm like, well, so Dad showed up, and then I give this talk to a German audience, and I had it like larded with some like awesome jokes, witticisms, funny metaphors, and all those sorts of things. Know your audience. German audience do not respond to those sorts of things the way Irish audiences do. Like at the end of it, so you do have to know your audience. At the end of that talk, when I got sort of disorganized, confused, and sweaty back to my seat, my daughter just turned to me and said, "Whoa, Daddy." It was not.
Wasn't the reaction you were hoping for?
It was not. It was just like one after the other, giving them my best material. Thud.
Yeah. So I guess there's a slight difference, right, between American presentation style, even if you want to take it, and even the UK are very much more, I've noticed, they generally like to stick to the science and maybe not as much of the story.
Well, I've been influenced. I wouldn't say that I talk the way Doug Green, as you might know, is a great speaker. He's been something of a mentor to me, though we never met at the same institution, but he's a friendly, smart guy who's always been helpful to me when I was starting my career, especially when Stan passed away. But just to watch him, he gives a great talk. I think it's a mistake to like imitate anyone. I don't think anyone could really imitate Doug Green, and that can be a mistake easy to fall into. But what there's a few simple things, which is like an animated style where you project your enthusiasm for your work, gets the audience interested. Get out from behind the podium if at all possible. Move around, walk around, get into it a little bit. And I think I do think that English are naturally more reserved, so that might come less naturally to them than it does for Americans, who I think have probably the right reputation of being more on the scale of being a little bit more like loud and outgoing. And I actually think that can be an advantage if you're trying to engage an audience and hey, sure, entertain them, fine. If that's what makes them remember your stuff, good. If you have a funny picture that they remember that tells a scientific point, that's very valuable. That's gold.
Are you still using your dog and the stick?
Oh yeah, I trot that out. Not every talk, but I'm telling you, people respond to that. People love that because they remember it. It's a funny story, but then it's something they can hang their memory on. That's like a really convenient peg to hang their memory on.
No, definitely, yeah. And do you think that developed your presentation style developed over time, or were you always, from, let's say, your postdoctoral career, were you just had this natural capabilities, or has it
No,
progressed?
I wouldn't say natural capability. I would say that I made, maybe more than some, I paid conscious attention to it, so that I tried to be critical of myself after a talk, figure out I mean, I don't mean to imply that what we do is like being a stand-up comedian, but stand-up comedians have to do this too. They have bits that work and bits that don't work. And you can tell if you get to the end of a talk and someone asks a dumbass question, okay, that's your fault as a speaker. Okay, that you should take that. You can't just write that off and say, oh, that person's a jerk. You have to say, whoa, what did I do wrong? For someone to ask a question that's stupid, I must have really missed the boat. And so you have to understand that, and you have to say, that's really not a stupid question. That's a failure to communicate on my part. You also, just like when you're in person, you sort of look at the audience and see, like, are they like asleep, whatever, and correct those parts where you see that. And I think some people, for some reason, don't go through this. I think it's I try to I like the feeling of giving a good talk. So to get that feeling, I need to get the feedback from the audience and try to continually improve myself and figure out what works and what doesn't. I think not everyone makes as conscious an effort to do this, but for me, it's always been a conscious effort. For sure, I've developed. I just, because you learn what works and what doesn't, and also I'm less afraid of public speaking than I was to begin with. I think people who say, like, oh, I'm afraid, everyone is. The only way you get better is by doing it again and again and again, and you tend to build up a callus.
Yeah, exactly. So you talked a bit about your work-life balance already. So how important is that to you in terms of, do you instill that in your lab group as well, or is it just something that you maintain, or do you try and instill this sort of work-life balance for your group as well?
Well, I mean, I do try to teach people in my lab. I want to train people who can have a lifetime, have like a happy, productive life in science. And that's not going to be the same. There's not a one size fits all, but I want people to know at least the possibilities are out there and the boundaries that they can work within. And part of that, well, here's a great example. Part of that is having children. I actually think I have an exceptionally fecund lab. You are one of many, many, many people who have had babies in proximity of their postdoctoral fellowships in my laboratory. And there's almost never a time when there isn't someone pregnant in my laboratory. But I mean, sure, there's like a loss in product. Usually after after, of course, the baby's born, and in the US we have a 3-month, you guys have an even longer one over in Ireland. But people have, it's a part of their life to have babies. And I think having babies and having children is a great part of life. And I don't want to discourage people from my lab from having that. I don't want to discourage them from having outside interests. I think they've been good for me. So my assumption is it's probably going to be good for them. So I try to encourage that, not like explicitly, but like I would say I model it in what I mean. People know I don't hide the fact that I garden, ride a bike, play sports, drink beer, whatever. That's totally out in the open, and it would be hypocritical for me to expect my lab to do differently. I think yes, science is a really important part of my life. Certainly it's my professional life, okay, but it is not totally what I am. And I don't expect that out of people. It is for some people, I think they do that way, but that's not my style. And you go elsewhere for that sort of experience. And I think that, yeah, I think science should be perhaps the biggest part of your life, if that's what you're committing your career to. Whatever your career is, it's always going to be a really important part of your life. Perhaps family would be a more important part of your life, but in terms of how you spend your professional activities, sure, that should be really important, but it can't be all of you. It can't be 100% of you. There have to be some other things, some other interests that you have, and I think that's very helpful.
Do you think your peers in Harvard have similar viewpoints to you, or are you like a juxtaposition to them?
I think many do. I think I'm more open about it than a lot of people are. There certainly are people who do not adhere to what I say and who don't believe it, who just think that, like, no, if you work 80 hours a week in a lab, that's twice as much work as 40 hours a week in a lab. So you ought to do 80 hours a week. That's how you make a career. And I'd just say that maybe that is a way for some people, and it wasn't the way for me. So I'm open to it not being the way. Now, mind you, if people want to come to my lab and work 80 hours a week, I don't stand in the way. Everyone's got to like find their way, but I simply don't demand it of people. But there's definitely a range at Harvard, like there is everywhere. But I think I'm more on the side of, like, to openly state I do not work weekends. That people wouldn't do that. I'd say it'd be rare to find people who say that out loud.
Yeah, well, for the most part, actually, you've instilled in this. I try and not work weekends. I think
Good.
I think it's really important to have like a rest and a break from it, and then you come back so much more refreshed and you do way more efficient work.
Sure. I'm not a highly religious person, okay, as you might know, okay. However, if you view the Bible as a document that evolved because that there was something, like, a very important part of the Bible and many religions is this idea of a Sabbath, okay, a day where you rest. I don't think that's by accident. I think there's sort of an evolutionary selection for us, unlike societies that could figure out a way, just like I do by ringing a bell and having a martini, having a Sabbath, that tells you, no, you're going to take a day off, you're going to chill. And you have to have really strict mandates, real strong punishments for violating that and for working. Okay, right? And so, sort of like I've installed on myself. But I think that tells you that there really is, in human nature, there is, whether you think there should be or there shouldn't be, there is this need to have a break, to have a really well-defined break between working hard and then working hard in between. If you can look forward to that one day a week of doing something, I think that's really all you need, but you do need that.
Definitely. So then lastly, Tony, we're going to finish up with one question. Are you an avid reader, and what literature sort of do you read outside of science that you think helps with your work?
Helps with my work.
Or applies to your work?
I don't know that anything I read outside of the lab helps with my work. I will say I read this book by Vinay Prasad recently called Malignant. That was extremely entertaining, informative, and that's one of the only times I've read an oncology or book outside of the lab. I read sometimes the occasional book about science, that'll expand my horizons a little bit, but it doesn't apply to my work. There'll be books about cosmology or physics and reality, which I think, fascinating topics, but I don't see how they really apply to me. I really use reading. That's one of those things that's like my time. Most recent book I read was an Agatha Christie novel. I'm very undisciplined in my reading habits. I'm now reading, I picked up now? I'm reading now a biography of Fritz Kreisler, a violinist. And there's no rhyme or reason. I read things purely for if I think it's going to be interesting and entertaining to me. And there's no thought of it being, when I read outside work, there's no thought of it of using it for my work. I feel like I do enough thinking and reading for that. And again, I think Sherlock Holmes had this theory, you don't want to clutter your mind. So if you read some of the stories, the Holmes and Watson stories, Sherlock Holmes, one of the lessons he teaches Watson, I can't remember, Watson told him some fact that everyone knew, like the world was round or something like that. And Sherlock replied to him, well, now that you've told me that, I shall do my best to forget it. And he goes, why what are you crazy? And he goes like, yeah, but it has absolutely no impact on my life. It's nothing I'm interested in. So I don't want to clutter my brain with these things. So you mentioned out of work reading, but I'm going to bring up in work reading. And I think that there's a real danger in cluttering your mind with too much reading. And I think that can impair sometimes clear thinking and stepping back and looking at the big picture. If you get too wrapped up in reading too many papers, I think you can, so many of these papers are context specific, very context specific. When we talk about this reproducibility crisis, a lot of it is there's true observations that are not generalizable. The true observations that don't go 1 inch beyond the specific context to which they were observed in the paper that you're reading. And if you try to jam your brain full of all these context specific observations, it just gets a big clutter and it's hard to keep it straight. And then you don't have your brain space free for like making, I think, interesting new connections. Your job as a PI is to be able to step back and understand what principles are generalizable and which ones are important, and not to clutter yourself with every single one. I have to say, I think I was a little critical of scientists on Twitter briefly and how they talk about how miserable they are. But the other thing scientists on Twitter do is they're really effective at doing my work for me and bringing to my attention, if you follow the right people, bringing to my attention the papers that in fact are interesting and mind expanding and generalizable and teach you something new. And I rely on a lot of people on Twitter to do my work for me, just in identifying that small number of papers that I will read, in the field of oncology and biology.
And do you still do a journal club within your group every week?
Yeah, we've switched to every other week just because scheduling. There's this lecture series that we participated on the same time on Friday, and I think every other week has sufficed okay for journal club, and that works well. But yeah, I think that's good. It's a fun time to come together as a lab. I think it's good to have lab activities that bind us together now more than ever when we physically can't be in the same room, and like discuss a paper that isn't ours and figure out what's good and what's bad. And as you gives me a chance to get up on my soapbox and pontificate about things that I feel strongly about. I don't know how interesting other people find it, but I like it.
Do you think that's a real useful tool actually for like teaching critical analysis and that?
Oh yeah.
Whole process, yeah.
So it depends what you want to teach. I mean, like one of the things I often like when people bring a paper up, I'll often start, people get right into it and I'll say, whoa, let's just look at the title, because I think the title is often a squandered opportunity to get people's attention. Okay. Or to say, and there's also like things that like, just like one example that I think I have cottoned on to more than other people. If you see the role of in a title, that should be a bell going off that there are no important conclusions in this paper, because they wouldn't talk about the role of X and Y if they could just tell you what that role was. If they said like X degrades Y, if they knew that, if they could make a solid conclusion, they would just say that in the title. But as soon as you see the role of, boom, it's going to be a paper that's going to be hard to read and probably not worth your time. That's a huge generalization, but you would be surprised how accurate that is. But that's the sort of thing, I think there's all sorts of communication issues associated with just the title and what you put in the abstract. That alone, you could spend, a whole journal club just no, you couldn't do that. That's too, but you could spend a significant amount of time just like looking at how you choose to communicate in these very valuable terse settings of a title and an abstract. And I'll often bore the lab to tears going over those sorts of things. But I think it's important when you're a PI on your own, you'll be alone in a room confronting these same issues. And it's good to have some principles to start with.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. They're great pearls of wisdom that you've just distilled to us, Tony, and hopefully to all the PhD students who are listening in. I really want to thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. It's been probably more educational for me, even though I worked in your lab for 5 years. I should have done this ages ago.
So if I had to give PIs out there starting out good advice, it would simply be get yourself postdocs like Tríona Ní Chonghaile, and you can't go too far wrong.
See, that's his generous side there coming out. Actually, that's one maybe final question, if you don't mind, now that I think about it. How you are very generous as a PI in terms of I think when people come to your work, there's about 5 people who've gone on and become independent PIs from your lab, at least now, if not more. How do you enable that?
I mean, you have to, I mean, like I said, I feel like the work that we're doing, there's so much I won't be done by the time I'm dead. And that just means that there's plenty of room for other people to do the work. And I think I'm fortunate in that I carved out a chunk of cancer biology. That's all our own. Okay, it's so, you know, we're colonists and there's plenty of room. There's plenty of room for all these different states where people do it. I mean, it bears talking about before a postdoc leaves to say, like, okay, what are you going to work on? Just like for convenience sake, you want to be like, well, if you're going to work on that, I'm not going to work on that, because, you know, there's plenty of room, but let's just not work on the same thing. And I think that's a good way. You know, it's not that hard as long as you pick something broad. Where you run into problems, and I'll make this, if in case anyone was there, don't say, I am an X protein lab. I think that's a huge mistake. Like, what's your lab study? Like, I never thought of myself as like a BCL2 lab. Okay, it's way too limiting, and it subjects you to way too much bias, because if you're an X protein lab, then X protein has to do everything. And you'll see, unfortunately, labs like this where, oh, X protein regulates progression through M phase. Oh, X protein is involved in the DNA damage response. Oh, X protein is involved in apoptosis and cell signaling and exosomes, or whatever the hot thing is. And that is just not a satisfying career. Moreover, it makes it tough if all you did is work on X protein and that's what your whole lab is based on. A postdoc leaves, they can't work on X protein, you know, they got to work on something else. So part of it also is, you know, maybe having broader concepts rather than, you know, a single. I really think it's a mistake to work on a single, to like be an X protein lab. I think that's a big mistake. And that makes it hard to do the sort of things you're talking about, which is giving postdocs room. But I don't think it's ever been a very hard thing to do.
Great. Thanks so much. This has been fascinating for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. Thanks, Tony.
Great. It's a lot of fun. See you.